Okay, I will start the recording now. Dr. Simpson, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to the Queen's School of Computing and Department of Diagnostic Radiology lecture series on AI and radiology. We're very happy to have you here, and I'd like to introduce my co-chair and pass it over to him, Dr. Omar Islam, the head of the Department of Diagnostic Radiology. Omar, I should introduce myself. My name is Amber Simpson. I'm from the School of Computing and the Department of Biomedical and Molecular Sciences at Queen's. I'm a Canada Research Chair in Biomedical Computing and Informatics, and I'm looking forward to this. Okay, you, Omar, it's over to you.
Thank you, Amber. Welcome everyone to our AI and Radiology lecture series. And for those of you who were able to attend last week, this is part 2. And for part 2, we have a bonus double bill for you. Instead of one speaker, we have 2 excellent speakers lined up today, Dr. Errol Colak and Dr. Anjum Emmett, who is returning after his talk from last week. Before I introduce our first speaker, Dr. Errol Colak, I'd like to first introduce a special guest who's been able to join us for the first hour at least, and that's our Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences here at Queen's, and that's Dr. Jane Philpott. Some of you may know Dr. Jane Philpott from her political career. She served as Canada's Federal Minister of Health, as well as Minister of Indigenous Affairs and President of the Treasury Board. Her background is as a family physician, and she's spent many years working in Markham Stouffville Hospital and at the University of Toronto, where she was associate professor in the Department of Family and Community Medicine. She has had a passion for global health, and if you look at all her work, she has spent many years in Africa, specifically in Niger and Ethiopia. She's responsible for developing the first training program in family medicine in Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia. She is founder of the Give a Day to World AIDS, which is a movement that started in 2004, and over the decades has raised many millions of dollars for HIV in Africa. And most recently, before she joined us in July, during the height of the first wave of the pandemic, she displayed her commitment to our community. She served as a volunteer in the front lines at Participation House, which is a home for vulnerable adults in Markham, which was hard hit by the pandemic. So we're proud to have her here at Queen's, and we welcome her here to listen to our great talks. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Philpott.
Thanks very much. And just to say a quick hello to everybody so we can get on to the talk. I appreciate the special invitation, and this topic is of great interest to me. I am not a content expert on this particular topic, but both Dr. Islam and Dr. Simpson know how passionate I am about AI and data in general in the healthcare sector. I have the privilege of playing a role as a special advisor to the Minister of Health and the Minister of the Treasury Board on the Ontario Health Data Platform. And as both Omar and Amber know, I'm super pumped about making sure we get radiology data into the Ontario Health Data Platform. And you guys are going to do cool, wonderful stuff and learn all sorts of new things that will actually have an impact on the front lines of care by actually being able to make sure that we expand our big data sets in the Ontario platform to include radiological data. And this is only the beginning, so I'm super eager to hear what I'm going to learn tonight, and thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome.
Welcome to our special guests.
Yes, exciting times are ahead for sure. I don't want to take too much time out of our speaker's time, so I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Dr. Errol Colak, who's a good friend of mine as well. So he's the lead of Diagnostic Imaging and Learning Algorithm Center at the Li Ka-shing Center for Healthcare Analytics Research and Training in Toronto at St. Mike's Hospital. He is assistant professor in the Department of Radiology at St. Mike's, University of Toronto. He's authored numerous papers and scientific articles, both nationally and internationally, and received multiple teaching awards from the University of Toronto. His research interests include machine learning applications in radiology, pelvic floor disorders, and GU imaging. He completed his residency training at U of T, followed by a fellowship in abdominal imaging and intervention from Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard Medical School. And he was recently awarded the Odette Professorship in Medical Imaging, Data Science and Analytics in 2019. And we're very pleased to have him here for his talk on prerequisites for the intelligent use of AI in medical imaging. Errol, the floor is yours.
Thank you. You guys can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to thank Dr. Islam for inviting me to participate in this wonderful lecture series. So let's get started. I have no disclosures. And what I'd like to do today is, from the perspective of a radiologist who has an interest in machine learning, discuss what I think are some important principles and ideas for us to understand if we want to reap all the potential benefits that artificial intelligence promises. And before I get into this, I want to state quite explicitly that I'm a very strong proponent of artificial intelligence, despite what the upcoming slides may suggest. I'm convinced that these technologies will transform healthcare for the better. We will have better patient care, better patient outcomes. These technologies will help reduce physician error. They will reduce variability in the clinical decision-making process. They will help personalize medicine. They'll help automate a lot of the mundane and redundant tasks that we as physicians spend every day. So instead of doing a lot of paperwork in these tasks, instead we could spend more time with our patients, and especially those that have complex needs. And lastly, these technologies will allow us to gain new insight into this vast amount of medical data that we have, that simply we can't really see these patterns or this richness in the data as human beings using our traditional techniques. So one of the key things about artificial intelligence machine learning from the perspective of a physician is to understand what our role is. And a question I commonly get asked by my clinical colleagues is, what do I need to know about artificial intelligence? And I often return that question with a question to them, and I ask them, well, what do you want to do? There are physicians who are interested in the design, the development, and implementation of these models, and these physicians will need to gain a very robust knowledge base. They basically need to be fluent both in medicine and in machine learning or data science. On the other end of the spectrum, we'll have end users. And let's say in the case of radiology, these end users will need to know how to safely use these algorithms and to be able to address questions that patients or other clinical colleagues may have. And I envision somewhere in between a supervisor or an administrative role where there will be some physicians who will be responsible to supervise this series of algorithms to make sure they're functioning in a safe manner. Our research team hosts interns from computer science and engineering, and one of the things they quickly realize is that there's some significant difference between natural images and medical images. So here we see two pictures of a cat. The image on the left is obviously an animal, the one on the right is a CAT scan of the brain. And what our interns quickly learn is that the misclassification of these images have different repercussions. You may misclassify a picture of an animal and really there are really no substantial real-world consequences. Whereas if you misclassify a head CT image and miss significant pathology or diagnose the patient with a pathology that isn't there, this patient may have significant negative consequences. And the other thing they comment on is they don't realize how rich medical information, medical images are. They contain very dense visual information, and this is particularly the case with 3D volumetric data sets such as CT or MRI. And an area of frustration for them is that real-world clinical data can get quite messy and often incomplete. And for many of them, this is their first exposure to the medical system, and they were expecting pristine data all the time, but this isn't the case. So here we see this image in the top left. It's pretty much an easy CT scan to interpret. Both a human and a machine can interpret it. There's perfect patient positioning. It's a young patient. There's no artifact. You know, this is easy to deal with. But the thing is, these other 5 images illustrate the real world. We can have patients that are moving around. We can have streak artifacts, distorted anatomy. pathology, poor patient positioning. So when we design our models, we need to not only consider the top left image, but these other cases, these, I guess, more exceptional cases that we may see. If we want to reap the benefits of AI, there's some critical questions we need to ask up front. And when we review the literature, the vast majority of published clinical prediction models, including the more modern ones such as convolutional neural networks and machine learning, most of them never see the light of day in clinical practice. And part of this is because these models really don't influence the clinical decision-making process in any way. In essence, they don't help healthcare providers, they don't improve patient outcomes, they don't optimize anything from the perspective of the institution. And it's fair to say that part of this might be because these models are developed to make use of large data sets that are readily available, rather than addressing a predefined real-world need as defined by medical practitioners or hospital administration. So this highlights the need for end users to be involved in the development of these models. We need to define upfront what is the use case. Is it relevant to the medical decision-making process, in the context of the healthcare system? And then after we've defined that, then we move on to data curation. The last thing we want to do is spend all this time curating data, designing models, evaluating them, and then have someone shrug their shoulders and say, this is completely useless, this won't help me whatsoever. Other critical questions to ask are, when we look at the performance metrics, are they relevant to the clinical context in which a model may be used? Are they able to express the intended improvement in patient care? Is the validation process robust? Does it reflect real-world constraints? Have bias and fairness been taken into account? If there is an issue of bias or fairness, has an effort been made to minimize it? Has consideration been made that perhaps the use of this model may perpetuate or worsen negative health outcomes or inequities for particular subsets of patients? And then lastly, end users should not be an afterthought. We need to ensure that their input is taken into consideration, because a negative end user experience can lead to error-prone behavior. So for example, alert fatigue or burnout. Also, do the outputs of these models make sense? Are they generated in an understandable fashion so that they're actionable by a physician, for example? So I want to discuss metrics a little bit. When we look at the machine learning literature, the vast majority of performance measures are based on an evaluation of categorical predictions. And we get these from a confusion matrix, and we see this on the right side of this slide. And the most commonly used metric is accuracy, which is a simple proportion of all the correctly classified predictions. But the problem with some of these metrics, such as accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity, is that they don't take disease prevalence into account. So for example, if the disease prevalence is 1%, the model could say negative every single time and yet yield an accuracy of 99%. So it's important to be aware of some of the nuance to these metrics and don't be deceived by what seems to be a great number, whereas if you actually dig deep, you can see that things such as this can happen. So for this reason, balanced accuracy might be a better measure than just plain old accuracy, and balanced accuracy is a mean of the sensitivity and specificity. In the medical world, we're more used to sensitivity and specificity, but they also may not capture what is important for many practical clinical applications. So for example, up front, we don't know which patients may or may not have a disease, and for this reason, we'll perform tests. And we want to know if a test is positive, what's the likelihood of a disease being present? So this scenario we see here on the slide, we can have a situation where the prevalence is 1%, and given a particular distribution of patients, have a sensitivity of 100%, specificity, accuracy, and balanced accuracy all over 90%, yet a positive predictive value of only 10%. In other words, this is a useless test. And this is why often in the medical, in the machine learning literature, we see something called the F1 score, which we don't see commonly in the medical literature. And this is the harmonic mean of the positive predictive value and sensitivity. Both of these, both the PPV and sensitivity need to be high for the F1 score to be high. And if 1 is approaching 0, the overall F1 score will be low. So for many of my medical colleagues, they aren't familiar with the F1 score, but this is why we use it. There are some other problems with these categorical measures, and one of them is this dependence on an arbitrarily defined classification threshold. So each data point in a sample is classified as being correct or incorrect with respect to this threshold. So for example, if we have a threshold of 50%, and patients that will have a 49% probability or 1% probability will be classified together, yet there are some inherent differences there. And this is something that accuracy can't capture. The other problem with some of these metrics is that false negatives and false positives are weighted equally, or the misclassification is weighted equally. And this can be problematic because in particular clinical contexts, a false negative can be dramatically worse than a false positive and vice versa. So here we have 2 patients who've had a head CT with subdural hematomas. The image on the left is a minimal paraphalcine subdural hematoma, whereas the one on the right is a bit larger. There's a little bit of early midline shift. And if we were to misclassify both of these, so let's say both were false negative scans as interpreted by a machine learning model, it's fair to say that the repercussions for the patient on the right could be worse than those on the left. Other commonly used metrics are the area under the curve, other metrics obtained for receiver operating curve or rank-based measures, but a lot of these have little relationship to clinical medicine. So perhaps better metrics are looking at the clinical benefit of using a model. How does it influence patient outcomes? How does it influence physician error and physician efficiency? Can we look at costs, both direct and indirect, and savings to the healthcare system? Should we evaluate, or can we evaluate the safety profile? Not every machine learning model is able to express a degree of confidence. So can we evaluate how machine learning, a particular machine learning model operates when it's operating outside of its comfort zone? Does it operate in a fail-safe mode, or does it improperly generate what seems like correct predictions when in fact they're quite wrong? And then lastly, user acceptance. As I mentioned before, a negative physician experience can lead to error-prone behavior, such as alert fatigue and burnout. As the disciplines of medicine and data science continue to work together on this very interesting area, it's inevitable that some terms that are common to both disciplines may actually have different meanings. So the term validation in the context of data science has a particular meaning. It's one of the steps in machine learning model development, where you have training, validation, and testing. And this is the validation step deals with fine-tuning of a particular machine learning model. And this is part of a larger process that is more of an objective evaluation or a statistical evaluation, looking at things such as accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity. Whereas in the medical world, clinical validation deals more with an evaluation related to the use of, for example, a model. We're looking at what is the performance, but what are also the consequences of its use in clinical decision-making or as part of the medical system. And the reason this is important, there's a bit of nuance here, is that a machine learning model may have good performance and may go through technical validation and testing and look quite good. And yet when you try to implement it in clinical practice, it may fail miserably. So for example, it's a lot easier to detect a very large lung cancer on a pristine chest x-ray in a well-curated or in a custom curated data set, but it's a lot harder to do that in the real world, where you have an ICU patient and you've done a portable x-ray with the patient malpositioned, a patient who might be obese, and there's superimposed pneumonia. So the reason clinical validation is important is that there's been a lot of promise, but a lot less data on proof of delivery. What we want to do is ensure that these vendors are able to back up their claims, and we want to have proof that these systems do and consistently deliver value to both patients and healthcare providers. So deep learning and machine learning is one of the branches. is a series of computational algorithms where that can independently learn from training data or the data that's provided to them. When this differs from traditional programming where programmers would have to tailor make or they'd have to customize their source code to a particular use case. So unlike human beings in machine learning, machine learning doesn't learn from understanding particular concepts and principles, but rather from the data itself. So as a result, machine learning models have a strong dependency on the training data, and performance is often very dependent on the actual composition of this data. And as a result, it may inherit some of the bias and errors in that data set. So for those who aren't familiar with how you train a machine learning model, this schematic is a very high level overview. And basically what we do is we have a large data set, and we partition it in such a way that we have a small part and we label it as test. And we put that aside. The remainder of the data we split into a training set and a validation set. And through an iterative process, which is beyond the scope of this talk, we develop a machine learning model. We fine-tune it on this validation set. And when we're comfortable and confident that things are working well, we evaluate it on its test set. And we want to make sure, what we're trying to do here is to see that there's no overfitting. In other words, we want to make sure that the machine learning model hasn't really basically memorized the data by having so many parameters. But the problem is, how do we know that this population that we use to train the machine learning model is representative of broader populations? And for this reason, we need external validation. So what we would like to use is data which is different geographically, temporally, and see, does the performance of that model, which looked pretty good with internal validation, is that sustained on these external data sets? And many articles in the literature have shown that the initial performance on the training cohort can look quite well, quite strong, and yet when you try it on external data, the performance drops substantially. So this is an example of that. This is an interesting article. What these investigators did was they developed a convolutional neural network to detect pneumonia on chest x-rays. And they had data from 3 sites. And they wanted to see, does performance differ between test sets that are derived from the training cohort versus external institutions? And what they found was that when they would use that model on external institutions, that the performance decreased. And another study showed something similar. So this group used 4 of the largest open source chest x-ray data sets, and they developed convolutional neural networks to detect some fairly common pathology on chest x-rays. And when they looked at the area under the curve for the 8 radiologic findings, they found that the best average result was when the test set came from the same set as the training cohort. So what these studies are suggesting is that we should expect a decrease in performance when applying these models to external data sets or basically real-world scenarios. And despite the importance of external validation, it's actually uncommon. So this group from South Korea did a review of 516 studies in the literature, both medical and non-medical, that dealt with artificial intelligence and image analysis. 71% of these were from the radiology community. And what they found was only 6% of the studies performed external validation. And according to them, none of them fulfilled what they felt were the 3 key design features, which was a diagnostic cohort design, the inclusion of multiple institutions, and prospective data collection. Hidden stratification is an interesting issue that we come across in the machine learning literature. And what this entails is that data can sometimes contain unlabeled subsets of cases or patients that can affect model training and performance. And at the average level or the aggregate measure of a model may look good, but when we look at the performance of that model for that particular subset of patients, we can see very poor performance. And this is an example of this. So this group looked at a convolutional neural network that could detect pneumothoraces on chest x-rays. And they took the data set of chest x-rays and they labeled them as to whether or not a chest tube was present or absent. And what they found was that the model did much better when a chest drain was present on the x-ray. Now, this doesn't really help us clinically because these patients have been recognized as having a pneumothorax, they've been treated, and the risk of pneumothorax-related harm is quite low. The more important thing, though, is that in patients without a chest tube, the convolutional neural network performed much worse in detecting pneumothoraces. And in fact, this is the clinical group where we want to identify them in order for them to get treatment. So by extension, we can think of a clinical scenario where the aggregate performance looks good because the larger subclass of patients just dominates everything. And as a result of that, a technology or machine learning model may gain regulatory approval. And yet in the cases that matter most, performance is poor and we may inadvertently harm them. And there's this medical truism that the rarer or the more significant pathology is rarer than the patients that have milder disease. And when we contrast that with human experts, in residency, we're trained to identify these subtle and rare disease variants. And in fact, these are the conditions which are underrepresented in medical imaging data sets that are used to train these models, and in fact, most prone to this problem of hidden stratification. The AIDOC ICH detection model is an FDA-approved AI solution which is meant to triage patients on whether or not they have intracranial hemorrhage. And what this group did was they looked at the performance of this model in terms of accuracy, sensitivity, specificity, PPV, and NPV, and then looked to see if there was any differences between the different types of patients. And that are, so this would be ER patients, inpatients, and outpatients. And what they found was that there was a pretty large drop in sensitivity and the positive predictive value in outpatients, and also that the accuracy was quite lower in inpatients. Yet if you look at the overall numbers, they actually look a lot better than in these two particular groups of patients. This was a pretty significant paper that came out a while back. And what this paper involves was a group that used about 25,000 high-quality retina images from a community-based diabetic retinopathy screening program in Thailand. And what they did was they developed a machine learning model that could detect diabetic retinopathy, grade its severity, and also detect macular edema. And what they found when they developed this model, it showed higher sensitivity than humans, similar specificity, a decrease in the false negative rate with a marginal increase in the false positive rate. And the conclusion of this paper was that this machine learning model could serve an important role in screening for diabetic retinopathy. And this study was followed up by another study where the investigators wanted to examine the social environmental factors which influence algorithm success and how the use of the system could influence nursing and nursing workflows and patient experiences. This was again based in Thailand. About 10% of Thailand's population has diabetes, and diabetic retinopathy is a complication of diabetes and a cause of blindness, or about 5% of blindness worldwide. In Thailand, about 1/3 of diabetic patients have vision loss in at least one eye. And screening of these patients is important because many of them are asymptomatic, or when they're asymptomatic, the disease may be reversible. So what the Thai government wanted to do was develop a national screening program, and they intended to have an attachment of 60% of the patients up front. And when we look at the resources available for this program, there's about 1,500 ophthalmologists in Thailand and 200 retina specialists for a diabetic population of 4.5 million patients. The existing workflow in Thailand is that there are these clinics which are staffed by nurses, and they'll screen for diabetic retinopathy, they'll provide diabetes education and foot care. In terms of the eye screening, what would happen is that the nurses would take images of the retina, upload them or send them by CD to an ophthalmologist. They'd be reviewed by an ophthalmologist at some point in the future, and patients who need a referral would receive a referral. The whole process would take about 10 weeks or so. So what was proposed instead was, let's use a machine learning model. The nurses will take an image of the retina, will upload it to the cloud. An inference will be returned nearly real time, and based on that, a referral could be made on the spot. And so they've designed the study. It was about 7,500 patients in 2 regions of Thailand and 11 clinics. And what they found was that there was quite a bit of variability in terms of the workflow of all these clinics. The actual process of taking images of the retina and the grading of the retina was fairly consistent, but the actual workflow and the day-to-day workflow through the clinics was dependent on nurses. The other thing that they found, which was interesting, was that only 2 of the 11 clinics had a dedicated room that was dark enough for the pupils to be dilated in order to get a really good image of the retina. So in the other 9 clinics, the retina was examined in a large room where other patients were getting foot care or nutritional education. So what they found was that the images that the nurses obtained were far below the threshold of the machine learning model and much inferior in quality to those used to train the model. The other thing they noticed was often the nurses will take 2 or 3 separate pictures to cover the entire retina, and these were being consistently rejected by the machine learning model. In fact, 21% of all the images were rejected. The other thing that they found, which was interesting, was the whole purpose was to improve workflow. But in some clinics, internet connectivity and speed was unreliable. And sometimes it would take a minute or a minute and a half to upload the images to the cloud. And while this might not sound like a lot of time, when you have a patient list of 200 to 300 patients, this was actually slowing things down and leading to a lot of frustration on the part of the nurses and patients. So what this study showed is that there was a tension between the quality of the images that the machine learning model needed in order to do its job versus what could be obtained in real-world resource-constrained environments. And probably the even more important thing is that this shows that an evaluation of the implementation of these technologies is probably of equal, if not more, importance than just the accuracy alone. We can have a very accurate model, and yet if it isn't implemented efficiently or if it fails the end user, that accuracy isn't really that important. This was a great article that was published recently, and this is a great overview of the literature that compares AI technologies to physician experts. And what they concluded was that the literature as a whole lacks transparency, clear reporting to facilitate reproducibility of these studies, that most articles fail to explore ethical concerns such as bias, and that there's even difficulty and clear demonstration of effectiveness of a lot of these models. They go on to say that they feel that the literature has exaggerated claims about the equivalence of a lot of these technologies to physicians, and that this has generated a lot of hype, which is unfortunately can lead to lofty expectations. And it'll be what they feel is that higher quality and more transparently reported evidence will help move our field forward. It'll help avoid hype. It'll help diminish research waste and ultimately protect patients. So when they looked at when they did their meta-analysis or literature review, they found that there are only 10 randomized controlled trials, and only 2 have been published so far with a low risk of bias, while the other 8 are still ongoing. When they look at the non-randomized trial, of which there are 81, 9 of them are prospective, and only 6 of them were tested in real-world settings. What I find very interesting is a lot of these articles discuss equivalence or improved performance in comparison to a physician, yet only 44% of these studies used experts exclusively, and the median was 4 expert physicians per study. Access to data is quite limited at about 5% of these studies, which to some extent is understandable because of concerns of PHI, but the interesting thing is source code was only available in 7% of studies. What they found was nearly 3/4 of studies had high risk of bias. Poor adherence to reporting standards was present in at least half of the studies. External validation when performed was usually from a different geographical region, but rarely from a different geographical region and time period. And they found that 75% of the abstracts talk about this performance of the model being at least as good as a physician, yet they rarely state that future prospective studies are necessary to prove this claim. Some people hope that regulatory agencies would be helpful in ensuring adequate validation of these technologies, but unfortunately, there's a very low barrier for entry. There's basically a fast track approval for these technologies. And when you look at the what's required for FDA approval, all they really need is internal review. They don't need peer review literature. And the amount of data needed for this validation is quite low. So for example, here are some FDA-approved models for intracranial hemorrhage detection, and we can see that the validation set can be as low as 198 cases from 3 sites. And what's even more interesting is when you look at the breakdown of cases used to validate the performance of this model, at least 3 of them had an equal number of positive and negative cases, and this does not represent real life where the incidence of ICH and head CT is usually 5 to 10%. In fact, you know, the FDA had a recent workshop that invited data scientists, physicians, regulatory experts, epidemiologists, and it dealt with autonomous AI. And the results of the workshop alarmed the American College of Radiology and the Radiologic Society of North America to publish an open letter, which is about 4 or 5 pages long. And the first statement of their summary is actually quite interesting, where it says, in summary, the ACR and RSNA believe it is unlikely the FDA could provide reasonable assurance of the safety and effectiveness of autonomous AI in radiology patient care without more rigorous testing, surveillance, and other oversight mechanisms throughout the total product life cycle. So unfortunately, the regulatory bodies and agencies could do better. In my opinion, what we need for validation are prospective studies where there's prospective registration, a priori analysis plans similar to other RCTs for clinical trials and interventions. These need to be evaluated in real world settings. We need transparent reporting systems such as Tripod. These studies need to be well conducted, have strong methodology. The reference standard needs to be high quality, and peer review is quite important. Bias is something that we need to take account of when designing these models, and bias can occur whenever a certain population or characteristics of a population is underrepresented, overrepresented, or missed entirely. And we need to consider the rights and interests of these populations that are excluded from the data sets when we train these models, especially if these members of the population are marginalized or otherwise vulnerable, who may have a different health status and needs from the other groups. And models that are trained on data sets which exclude these populations are likely not well suited to the needs of these excluded groups and could further exacerbate inequalities. And the other thing which is important is that bias can actually cause disproportionate errors in different populations. And this can lead to some significant ethical issues surrounding, by creating and perpetuating irregularities and inequalities. And there's also the issue of the use of these technologies in resource-rich and resource-poor communities. So we need systemic testing of bias and fairness to minimize inequalities that could arise from the use of these technologies. This was a recent publication from JAMA, and they investigated the geographic location of the cohorts used to train these models, and they found the vast majority of them were from California, Massachusetts, and New York, and they found that 34 states in the US were not represented whatsoever. And it's fair to assume that there must be some population level differences between Palo Alto, Boston, New York, and these 34 states that aren't represented. So assuming we have a highly accurate model, we've clinically validated things and things look great, there still can be some potential barriers to its use. Trust and interpretability are important. We need to evaluate whether or not the output is reliable. Is it something that a physician can understand and therefore act upon it? We need seamless integration of these technologies into the clinical workflow. The clinical workflow is as they are right now, are quite hectic. The last thing we want to do is make them worse. We also don't want to burden end users with more work. And when we look at something such as computer-aided detection and mammography, which is fairly widespread, the literature shows that CAD actually increases the workload on radiologists without any particular improvement in radiologist diagnostic accuracy. We also need a way to ensure that these models, that we have a surveillance in place, because with time, patient characteristics and disease characteristics can change. And if we don't consistently ensure that this model is operating safely, the model may start making errors due to this, this shift, this calibration shift. In a wide variety of domains, algorithmic predictions are far superior to human advice. And logically, one would assume that if that's the case in those particular areas, we should choose the algorithm over the human. But despite this, there's a lot of evidence in the literature where human experts and lay people may be resistant to using advice or predictions from an algorithm, and often instead use the inferior advice from humans. And this is termed, or this is called algorithm aversion in the literature, and this could be a potential significant barrier for some segments in society. This was an interesting study where study participants were asked to assume the role of an MBA admissions officer, and they were presented with the applications of potential students for the MBA school, and the subjects were asked to predict the success of candidates in terms of the GPA, respect by their peers, prestige of the job that they'll eventually get, and their success after 2 years. And subjects were also told that a very robust statistical model was developed, and the study was designed in such a way that some subjects had to make a prediction alone, some could only use a statistical model, and some could use both. And what they found was that users were less likely to use the algorithm after seeing it make mistakes. And this is despite the fact that on average, the algorithm performed much better than humans. And they had greater intolerance for errors made by the algorithm than humans. So the errors made by the algorithm tended to be small, whereas those by the humans were much larger. And nevertheless, observing a human error did not significantly decrease the tendency to choose human prediction. So there's likelihood that for some people, they're more likely to abandon an algorithm for a human expert for making the same mistake. Automation and computer aids are usually employed to help decrease errors. And when these aids work well and they're consistently perform well, they do that. They basically reduce the intended error. However, the literature does show that while reducing or eliminating one form of error, these computer aids may in fact create opportunities for other types of error to occur. So what can happen is that with very reliable systems, humans start to rely entirely on the work of the machine or the algorithm instead of applying their own critical judgment. And when this happens, is that the human being starts to devolve all responsibility to the model, and in some ways they're completely outside of the decision loop. And this is called automation bias in the literature, and there's two forms of this. One is omission bias, where unless a user is prompted that there's an issue, they aren't aware of it and they'll continue with dangerous behavior. So for example, a physician may order a dangerous drug, or there's a potential drug interaction, and they'll assume everything is safe unless the computer triggers an alarm. On the other hand, there are these errors of commission where there's such blind trust in an algorithm that the user will suspend their own judgment and training and go along with whatever the algorithm says. And there are some users where they start to view these algorithms as being infallible, and they're particularly susceptible to this. And there's even greater dependence on these technologies in environments where there's high workload, tasks are complex, and there's multiple tasks competing for a person's time. This was a very interesting study. What this group did was they took data from a very important paper that looked at computer-aided detection of mammography and reanalyzed the data. The data in the paper dealt with 50 readers, 180 mammograms, 60 cancers, 40 of which were visible on the baseline mammogram, and 20 were seen on subsequent mammograms. And what they found was that there was no significant improvement using CAD. So what this group did was they wanted to examine the influence of the difficulty of the cases and a reader's discriminating ability. In other words, they wanted to look at poorer readers versus better readers. So what they found was there was a distribution where more of the cases were easier, but there were some more difficult cases and a bell curve distribution of reader skills. And the interesting thing they found was that with CAD, the sensitivity of the less discriminating readers for the easier cancers improved. But more importantly, the sensitivity of the highly discriminating readers for the difficult cases decreased. And there was a significant negative impact on the sensitivity of the highly discriminating readers for interval cancers. So the finding on that initial study that there was no significant overall effect was due to the systematic positive and negative effects of these users canceling each other out rather than there being no effect at all. And this shows that there can be differential effects, although subtle, on different users. And this is something we need to take consideration of when we're developing and evaluating these tools. So we're living in pretty exciting times. Most of us will see the transformation of healthcare in our lifetime. And some key takeaway points is we need to ensure that we have relevant use cases for these technologies, that they'll actually make an impact in real world clinical environments, that they'll actually improve patient care, improve hospital efficiency, and make physicians more efficient. This will require close working relationships between the key stakeholders. So this includes patients, healthcare providers, data scientists, and hospital administrators. Robust clinical validation is important. There is a growing number of voices that is expressing the idea that the clinical validation of these technologies should be no less rigorous than those of any new drug or test. And we need to be aware of the potential barriers to the adoption of these tools. By recognizing them, they'll give us an opportunity to deal with them and ultimately, hopefully, enjoy the benefits of these technologies in clinical practice. So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. Let me be one to give you a round of applause since you don't get to see other people. It's a little weird sometimes presenting on Zoom. You kind of feel like you're presenting into a black hole. Any questions for Dr. Colak? You can type them into the Q&A and I'll read them out. We have the first question is, can you elaborate a little bit more on the differences between AI, CAD, machine learning, and deep learning?
I think if I had to do it with one word, branding might be the easiest way. I guess you could say deep learning is the bigger umbrella. Machine learning and that set of technologies falls under it. Artificial intelligence is a very big grab bag term. And then CAD, how do you define CAD? Is it computer-aided detection, computer-aided diagnosis? I think a lot of it's marketing, to be quite honest.
Yeah, and CAD's been around for many decades, and hasn't really caught on, right? There's been breast CAD for a long time that's implemented in clinical workflows, but isn't really used or isn't really trusted. Other questions? You know that I'll ask questions. I'll just keep asking questions. Can you talk about, so there's a question here, can you talk about the variation in scan protocols and that this happens over time, right? And that there's differences in older data versus newer data. This is particularly true of MRI, less true maybe of CT. CT's been pretty consistent for a while. Can you comment a little bit on that and the challenges of that?
I can give you a real world example of this. My research team is working on a convolutional neural network to detect cervical spine fractures on CT. And when we were curating our data set, we looked at 10 years worth of CT data, and protocol and series description names change a lot over time. And I think we found, and also series number. So we found 9,000 unique combinations of series number and series description for cervical spine CTs over the course of 10 years. So that just shows you that this is a very big problem. So even at you know, that in itself is the first problem, is which series do you look at? And then in terms of protocol changes over time, we found consistently slice thickness was changing, the kernels were changing. It is a big problem. I'm surprised industry hasn't tackled this issue yet. I wish they did, or at least at a more governmental level where you can at least say things, because
I wish the government would just come in and say, this is how you're going to image, and or this is how you're going to report it in the imaging standards for this type of equipment, so you can at least find what it is in the correct areas of the DICOM header, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we want to maintain some autonomy for physicians because there's regional differences in practice patterns and different, you might have to adjust different protocols and parameters.
Yeah, and I think different protocols is fine, but I think actually encoding the data in a consistent way so we can figure out what the protocol is and we can de-identify the scan.
Absolutely. At the very least, you'd hope that a vendor would be consistent within itself.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, that's not the case. So I think vendors have a lot of homework to do to fix this problem. And I think people in the data science community should be raising their voices and saying, please help us with this, because this is a big problem. In fact, I participated in the curation of 2 RSNA AI challenge data sets. And this was even more problematic because we had data coming from Canada, the US, Brazil, and Turkey. So now you have even language differences on top of these other issues. So it's a big problem. This needs to be fixed.
Mm-hmm. And related to that, and I asked the speaker this last week, what is the role of structured reporting in all of this?
Do I have to touch that question?
Yeah.
I like structured reporting because it really simplifies data mining. So this is me taking my radiologist hat off. As a radiologist, I like it. And I know that this may not be a popular opinion with some radiologists, but from a data science perspective, I find that it's a lot easier to parse structured reports. And you can go from a very large report to at least narrowing it down to a particular paragraph and then use focused NLP on that. Whereas you have free text, which is verbose, it becomes quite challenging. And even if you have a human labeler reviewing these reports rather than NLP, it's still much easier with structured reports than it is with free text.
Do you think structured reporting is something we could implement across many specialties, like in pathology, in basically anything? Do you think there's any appetite for doing that?
You're talking to a guy who loves it. So
Yeah.
You know, structured reporting, to be honest, structured reporting, I don't think is the ideal solution for every single exam type and every modality for every use case. I would say I use structured reporting probably for 90% of the reports I do, but in 10% of the reports, I'd estimate it actually makes things worse. So it depends. It's like everything in life. You know, if you're very rigid, you don't want to be so dogmatic that you create these reports which are 3 times longer just to say I believe in structured reports. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, usually it's great. Sometimes it doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. And we have a question from the audience. Some larger hospitals will be quicker to purchase or develop AI to improve and facilitate the reads of human radiologists. How can Ontario level the field for smaller hospitals?
Good question. The funding of these technologies is actually a complicated issue because there's competition for the healthcare budget. And even right now with these technologies, I'm not so certain that we can express a definite clinical benefit or improvement in patient outcomes. So even before we talk about how do you get the technologies, I'm not so certain that a lot of these technologies are ready to be deployed to begin with. And now once they're ready to be deployed, then the question is, what is the costing model, or how do you do, is it an app store where you get a free infrastructure that's someone deploys and you deploy these algorithms? Is it per accession or per study? Is it a provincial thing where the province buys these technologies for every single hospital? I think it's a little bit early for a lot of these technologies, to be honest.
Thank you. Dean Philpott, do you have a question? I see your camera came on.
I would just always jump in when I hear about how we're going to pay for things. So I think first of all, that was fantastic talk, but I do think we have to make the case for it. To get the funding, we're going to have to demonstrate the return on investment. So I think that's where the next few years are going to be really critical for demonstrating that we actually can influence outcomes in a significant way, and that the dollars invested will be worth it. But I think based on the possibilities that we can all envision, the case will be made, but we're not there yet.
Can either of you talk a little bit about this idea of value-based medicine? So coming from the US, there is no sense of value-based medicine. There's no sense of we improve patient outcomes, we improve health services outcomes, and that's good. Really, it's let's bring more money into the hospital, and that's really it. So can you talk a little bit about what value means in the context of our patients?
Do you want to go first, or do you want me to?
I let the dean go. And your questions are too hard.
Well, I think that's actually a really great question, and I actually think that that's part of Amber, what you and Omar and others are going to do is demonstrate that this is actually that there's a cost-benefit analysis that on investments in machine learning for outcomes, and so not just does it work, but does it work and does it save money? Because we all know that we'll never have sufficient resources for the care that we need, but it's not always about adding more resources, it's about working more efficiently. And so doing comparative analysis from a cost or value-based perspective on AI versus usual care, I think is some of the really important studies that need to be done.
And I see a question here from Heidi Ploeg. So she's asking about standard calibration of CT grayscale to quantify density, and can that be mandated? So then you could do mechanical properties to the grayscale. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Errol, about like mandating CT protocols or protocols broadly?
Well, you could take even a further step back and say that the DICOM standard really isn't a DICOM standard in many ways. That the fundamental principle upon which a lot of medical imaging is based has so much variability. You can take DICOM images from one scanner and it loads without any problem in one PACS view, and then you load in a different one and it completely breaks. So I think there's an even more fundamental problem with DICOM itself, and that's without even getting into issues of PHI, hidden tags, incompatible tags. So DICOM needs to be fixed. I'm blaming a lot of big bodies here, but I think that's one thing. And then, ultimately, as end users in the data science community, if we have a very united voice that says, we want these particular things to be standardized, that we're a growing community. We're probably one of the biggest growing research disciplines out there. There's a lot of public interest in this. We will improve healthcare through our efforts. So I think we have a lot of strength, and it's just a matter of us demanding this from the vendors. But let's be honest. How many CT vendors do you have? It's less than 10 worldwide. So I don't think it's an insurmountable problem. It's just a matter of the end users, which is us, saying, fix this. Otherwise, every single group on its own is recreating the wheel. I know
I'm hoping that this piece about the Ontario health teams and the digital infrastructure will start mandating at least the reporting of DICOM. So the standardization of the format in some way, not necessarily the protocols, that's hard to do, but just that we can get the information out in a reasonable way. Errol, thank you very much for your talk. I think we're going to go to our second talk now. So the four of us will give you some applause. And thank you, Dr. Philpott, for coming.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see you all.
Thank you. And now I'm going to pass it over to Omar again to keep us moving.
Yes, but I'm actually going to get my question in for Errol as well, if you don't mind.
Chair's choice.
It's my choice. So Errol, thank you very much for the talk. I took notes, even though it's going to be available online. I really had to take notes. A couple of things which I kind of will remember. One, AI is not the panacea that we all, we hope it would be. Perhaps it will be. Number two, FDA approval does not have the same power that we thought it would, and especially in this day and age of COVID and vaccines, etc. A lot of politics come into play when we're talking about FDA approval. Question for you. So at the intersection of industry and academia, and we all know that we'll need industry partnerships for this to succeed. Speaking from a patient's perspective or from the perspective of an advocate of a patient, how much should I charge for my chest x-ray?
Perspective of an AI model that interprets it, or in general?
In general. How much is my chest x-ray worth?
That's such a complicated question. I don't want to answer that question.
Can Omar sell it?
Perhaps
as a head of
No, I
radiology?
understand your question. Your question, how much can the data be sold for? Okay. It's a very complicated ethical question, because especially in the Canadian healthcare context, because the taxpayer has built the building, bought the scanner, pays for the tech, pays for the contrast, pays for the PACS, pays for the radiologist, pays for the voice recognition, et cetera, et cetera. So one could argue that ultimately the taxpayer owns the data, right? And that they are a key stakeholder. And I mean, we see this is a very complicated ethical issue, and we could see that with Sloan Kettering, with the controversy that was in the media a few months ago, where physicians who were involved in a startup were selling the data to the startup, where this can go. And it's a complicated answer. I think that the patients should be, I mean, it's their data. There needs to be some recognition of that, whether or not that means that in publicly funded healthcare systems, that in exchange for this data, that the models generated by the data can be freely used for that population. I don't know. It's a complicated question.
Right.
Not a good answer, but it's a very complicated answer.
It's not fair to throw that at you right now, but it's something that we should all think of. How do we include the patient and advocate for the patient as well, since they're really the reason why we're here. And
absolutely. And also, do patients have a right to say, I don't want my data sold?
Right.
Do they have to opt in, or is it a man? Do they opt in or do they opt out? Yeah. How do we recognize their voices?
So a great question we had last week, which I'm not going to expect you to answer, was, so under the Freedom of Information Act, we're supposed to get information about our medical records. So if we have an AI that's built on our medical records, do we also have, should we also be given access to a list of the AIs that have used our data in some way?
This field of where AI and medicine are intersecting is going to lead to a lot of new ethical questions, whether it's issues of commoditization of patient data, the issue of bias, fairness. This is whatever happened whenever you have these new cutting edge technologies or these new advances. This is expected, and I think we need to face these things head on rather than shy away from them. And as members of the medical and data science community, I think we should also have our voices heard in this discussion. Having industry dictate the terms here, I think as physicians and patient advocates and also as data scientists, we should probably be at the forefront of this discussion.